Hello, I'm reading Ribsy again, chapter 4. And I have my pups here. They're sitting in the window, enjoying the day. It's not sunny today, but they still enjoy coming out to this little house and sitting in the window. We'll see if they fall asleep like last time. So we found out that Ribsy has gotten lost from his boy, Henry Huggins. He got lost at the mall when he jumped out of the window of the new car. First, he was picked up by a family that had 4 girls, and they proceeded to give him a bath. A lot of bath. He smelled like lilacs, or smelled like flowers. And he didn't like that smell. Tried to get rid of it, and he was rolling in the mud and running, and he was picked up or he went to the back door of an old lady who ended up taking him inside and keeping him for her pet, feeding him 3 times a day, and he got kind of fat and sluggish because he couldn't be a dog. She was treating him like a person. So now we come to chapter 4. It's called Ribsy Becomes a Mascot. A mascot is like our bulldog, or it's like Michigan Tech has the husky dog, Blizzard. A mascot is an animal that supports a team. Here we go. Ribsy becomes a mascot. The Huggins had received a number of telephone calls in answer to their advertisement in the newspaper. A man had seen a dog that sounded like Ribsy running down Broadway, but he did not know where the dog had gone. A lady had been feeding a stray spotted dog for over a month. She said she'd really like to get rid of him. A boy called to say that he knew a couple of dogs that sounded like Ribsy, and how much was the reward. Another lady called to say she didn't know anything about Ribsy, but she did have 5 perfectly adorable pups. Hey, there's my pups back in the window. And she'd be glad to give one to Henry. It was late in the evening, after the advertisement had been running for several days, that Mr. Dingley, the father of the 4 girls, and George telephoned to say that he had read the notice and he was sure it must have been Ribsy. His family had picked up in the parking lot at the shopping center. He told of the tale of finding Ribsy, of the bubble bath, and of Ribsy's disappearance into the night. He was sorry he had not called sooner, but the 3 children had come down with the chicken pox, and he had been busy. Bubble bath! Henry was disgusted when his father had relayed the story to him. A bunch of dumb girls giving Ribsy a bubble bath? For Pete's sakes! No wonder he ran away. At least we know the direction in which Ribsy went, said his mother. That's something. We'll let the ad run a little longer and see if it won't bring results, said Mr. Huggins. Bubble bath, muttered Henry, bubble bath. By the time the advertisement had run for 3 weeks, the Huggins had received several more phone calls and gone to look at 3 different dogs. None of them were Ribsy. Well, Henry, I don't like to say this, said Mr. Huggins at last, but I think we may as well stop the ad in the newspaper. Henry nodded. He could not think of anything to say. He was sure Ribsy had to be someplace, that someone must have him, but that someone, quite plainly, was not going to give up Ribsy, was not looking at the newspaper advertisement. And why should he? Ribsy was such a good dog. Anyone would want to keep him. Now there's a big break in our story. Whenever that happens, it's either like a day has passed, time has passed, or we're thinking about a new character. I think we're now thinking what Ribsy is doing. By now, Ribsy was back inside the city limits. He had learned from his own neighborhood on Click-Clack Street that so many people fed their pets outside the back door or in the garage. This made his search for food fairly easy as he continued his journey. He had only to investigate backyards, and sooner or later his nose led him to a dish with a few crumbs or food. If he was lucky, to a whole bowlful. Unfortunately, most of the people whose yards he passed through kept cats. He gulped down several meals of rather fishy cat food. Workmen eating lunch out of lunch buckets were another source of food. Workmen tearing up the streets, workmen repairing telephone wires, workmen putting new roofs on old houses. All of them were glad to share a corner of their sandwich with Ribsy. Here's a picture. Or they'd even give Ribsy a donut to the friendly dog. Hunger was not Ribsy's problem. He was no longer sure of which way was home. None of the streets he followed seemed to lead to Click-Clack Street. He searched for something familiar, something that would lead him home to Henry Huggins. He trotted along the sidewalk, looking up at the people he met, hoping that one of them would turn out to be a member of his family. They were always strangers, but Ribsy was not easily discouraged. He continued to search until he came to a mailman waiting for the bus. Ribsy, who had often followed Click-Clack Street mailman on his rounds, was delighted to see someone who looked a little bit familiar. He pranced right over to the bus stop, tail a wagging. "Hello, Pooch," said the mailman. Encouraged, Ribsy sat down beside the mailman, who obligingly patted him on the head. That, as far as Ribsy was concerned, was that. He would follow this mailman, who was sure to lead him to hit the Huggins house. When the bus stopped, the mailman swung aboard and sat down. Ribsy scrambled on in the bus after him and flopped down at his feet. "Hey," said the driver, "that dog can't ride the bus." "He's not my dog," said the mailman. "Somebody get him out of here fast," said the driver. "I got a schedule to keep." A high school boy was glad to help. He seized Ribsy by the collar and pulled. Ribsy stiffened his legs and dug his toenail into the floor of the bus. He was not going. The boy pulled so hard that his collar began to choke him. "Don't hurt the poor dog," cried an old lady from the back of the bus. "Take your hands off him this instant, or I shall report you to the pet patrol." The boy let go of the collar. "Wait, I have an idea," said the mailman. He slipped the strap of his mail pouch off his shoulder, got up, and walked quickly down the aisle. Ribsy was not going to be left. "What do you want, Jesper?" "Hi, Jesper." Ribsy was not going to be left. "Look," squealed the owner of the... Wait a minute, I missed something. And followed the mailman to the rear door of the bus. "Hi, babies." The mailman was surprised him by sprinting to the front door and jumping on the bus once more. Oh, so the mailman got out of the back door, sprinted along the sidewalk, and then got in the front door, leaving Ribsy on the sidewalk. Sometimes city buses have a front door and a back door. The mailman sprinted to the front door and jumped in the bus once more before Ribsy could jump in after him. The door was shut in his face and the bus drove off in the particular smelly cloud of exhaust. Ugh. Ribsy had never had a mailman treat him like this before. He did not know what to think. At first, he tried to run after the bus, but the smell of the exhaust soon discouraged him. He wandered along the sidewalk until he saw three girls carrying a brown paper. Instantly, Ribsy's spirits rose. Here was a familiar sight. Girls with lunches and paper bags were sure to lead him to school, and there he would find Henry. "What's the matter, Jesper? You want to come on camera?" "Okay." And there he would find Henry at the schoolyard. He followed happily along with the girls, just close enough to catch a whiff of their lunches. Tuna fish, peanut butter, and pot roast. That pot roast sandwich smelled delicious. "Don't look now, but there's a dog following us," said one of the girls, and giggled. The other two thought this was funny. Hi, Jasper. They all giggled and glanced back at Ribsy, who trotted along, minding his own business. Sure enough, just as Ribsy expected, the three girls led him to the familiar place, a 2-story red brick school building, surrounded by a fence, an asphalt playground. That's like tar. His spirits rose even higher. Henry must be around here somewhere. After noticing that the three girls left their lunches on the bench before they went off to play hopscotch, Ribsy put his nose to the ground and ran around the schoolyard searching for a scent of Henry Huggins. He picked up many scents of boys in sneakers, and none of them had the exact smell of Henry. Ribsy also picked up the scent of pot roast sandwiches once more, and this time he helped himself to the lunch bag. Oh no. There was no use in letting a perfectly good piece of meat go to waste when he had eaten so much fishy cat food lately. Look, squealed the owner of the pot roast sandwich. That dog has my lunch. The chase was on. Every boy and girl in the schoolyard was chasing little Ribsy. He loved it. He hadn't had so much fun since he had been lost. He ducked and dodged with the brown paper bag in his mouth. Sometimes he went far enough ahead. He dropped the bag a second and stood panting, with a laughing look on his face as if to say, "Catch me if you can." Then, when someone almost reached him, he snatched up the lunch and ducked and dodged some more. Finally, the yard teacher blew the whistle and it hurt Ribsy's ear. Someone stopped chasing him. "Here, doggy," coaxed the yard teacher. "Nice doggy." Ribsy eyed the teacher warily, ready to run if she should decide to chase him. Instead, she approached him slowly with her hand extended. "Nice doggy," she said. "Give us the lunch." That a boy. She was so friendly, Ribsy let her pet him and take the lunch. "The poor dog is hungry," said the owner of the undamaged pot roast sandwich. "Do you see Allie has come to sit on my lap?" "I'll give him some out of my lunch pail," someone said, and a dozen lunch bags were opened. "Now, children, you know dogs are not allowed on school grounds," said the yard teacher. The yard teacher spoke in a mild voice because, after all, Ribsy was such a nice, friendly dog. We call them the playground teachers or the playground aides. They call them yard teachers. No one seemed to hear her. Ribsy found himself being offered pieces of sandwich, potato chips, carrots, raisins, cookies. He accepted the most appetizing bites, to the delight of the givers, while those who brought their lunches in the cafeteria petted him and wished they had brought something to feed him. Ribsy could tell he was going to like this place. When the bell rang, Ribsy went right into the school with the boys and girls, and into the near classroom, which happened to belong to Mrs. Sumchek, second grade. He looked around the room at the desks and blackboards, and at an empty aquarium on the ledge below the window. An aquarium is like a fish tank. None of this was especially interesting to him. What do you think? Are you interested, Allie? Then he walked to the door of the cloakroom at the back, sniffed the lunches and wraps, and walked to the other door. Satisfied with his investigation, he flopped down near the cloakroom. That's like our cubbies, our coat room door, and lay his nose on his paws. He had spent the night dozing in the cold garage and was glad of a chance to nap in the warm, dry place that smelled pleasantly of sneakers, lunch bags, and boys and girls. Are you getting sleepy? The 30 boys and girls of Mrs. Sunchek's second grade took their seats while Ribsy dozed off. Suddenly, he was awakened by the sound of 30 pairs of feet sliding from the room under their desks and 30 boys and girls standing up. Everyone was going someplace, and Ribsy was not about to be left behind. He jumped to his feet, too. "I pledge allegiance," began the class, "to the flag of the United States." They were not going somewhere after all. After the flag salute, the pledge, was done, the class sat down, and all but 2 boys nearest Ribsy, who petted him in such a way that Ribsy knew he somehow pleased them. The girl raised her hand. "Yes, Penny?" said the teacher. "Mrs. Suncheck, there is a dog in the back of the classroom. When we stood up for the Pledge of Allegiance, he stood up too." Penny was pleased to have announced this news to the class. Everyone turned in their seats to admire such a smart dog. "He must be very patriotic," said Mrs. Suncheck pleasantly. "And now, Danny, will you please take him outdoors, back to the playground?" Reluctantly, With several backward glances, Ribsy allowed Danny Yaxley to lead him outdoors where the asphalt tar was cold and unfriendly after the warm floor of the schoolroom. Ribsy looked sadly at the door that closed behind him, and the minute the milkman came to deliver the boxes of milk cartons, he slipped inside, returned to the second grade classroom, and flopped back down in the cloakroom on the cloakroom door. Penny waved her hand. Mrs. Suncheck, the dog is back. Mrs. Suncheck merely said, the dog is not bothering anyone, Penny. Pay no attention to him. Mrs. Suncheck did not like to waste class time. There were so many interesting things to do and important things to do in second grade. That was how Ribsy became a member of second grade. He spent his nights in the garages of owners who had left the doors open. In the morning, he went to school with the neighborhood children who fed him bits of their lunch, and in the day or two began to bring him an occasional dog biscuit. When he was thirsty, he only had to go to the drinking fountain in the schoolyard, and some boy always turned the drinking fountain on for him. After he managed to lap the squirting water with his tongue, the boy usually had a drink too. Following the flag salute, when he was sure of being petted if he stood up, he dozed all morning, going out at recess with the rest of the class. Oh, there's a picture. He's standing in line with the kids. At lunchtime, he got in line and went to the cafeteria where he finished the sandwiches of those who asked him to accept peanut butter sandwiches. These Ribsy would sniff and politely refuse. Peanut butter stuck to his teeth. After lunch, he lay at the back of the room with his nose on his paws, waiting for school to be out so he could play with anyone who wanted to play with a friendly dog. It was a pleasant life. This had gone on for several days. Then one day at lunchtime, Ribsy lined up as usual and went to the cafeteria. He was well behaved, stayed with his class, sat down beside the table where Mrs. Suncheck's bag lunchers were eating, while the rest of the class lined up to buy their lunches. He was licking the remains of a crunched up potato from the floor when he became aware of a man standing over him. Who do you think that man is? The principal? Maybe. And who is our friend here? Asked Mr. Woody, the principal. A dog, said Bill Amato. A nice dog, said Penny Moriesa. Ribsy was pleased when the principal stooped to pet him. Whose dog is he? Asked Mr. Woody. Search me. He comes to school every day. He lives around here somewhere. Please see, he has a collar. He pointed to the red collar Mrs. Farley had bought Ribsy. I know, said Mr. Woody. I have seen him. Perhaps he belongs to someone who is away at work all day. From the fancy red collar, I would guess he belongs to a lady. Oh, please let him stay, begged Penny. He's an awful good dog. He stands up for the Pledge of Allegiance. Mrs. Suncheck's bag lunchers nodded. Ribsy wanted to please this man, so he held up his left paw. Mr. Woody smiled and shook hands. Well, fella, I see you're a southpaw. Or you shake with your left hand. It looks as if Mrs. Suncheck's room has a mascot, said Mr. Woody. As long as he behaves himself, he can stay. Mrs. Suncheck's bag lunchers beamed at the principal. That means they're pretty happy. Our mascot is always good, said Penny earnestly, and the others nodded. The weeks went smoothly until Friday arrived. Friday, in Mrs. Suncheck's room, was show and tell. It started like any other day. Mrs. Suncheck looked around the class and noted that Danny Yaxell was absent. Ribsy stood up with the rest of the class to salute the flag and flopped down for a nap. Does anyone have anything to share this class this morning? Kathleen Anderson came to the front of the room to show off her doll, which had a pair of real sunglasses. The boys looked scornful. Yeah, who wants to see a doll if you're a boy? Pete Schleckman showed a tool chest he had gotten for his birthday. He said his mother would not let him use the hammer or saw in the house. The boys looked interested. They wished they had a tool chest too. Philip Goldberg had just finished telling about a time he was riding downhill with his father and the brakes of the car refused to work. When the door to the classroom opened, Danny Yaxel came in with his mother, who was carrying a sheet of corrugated cardboard and a wooden box with holes bored in the side. It was a rule in Mrs. Suncheck's room that anyone who brought a pet, for show and tell, had to also bring a parent. Are you liking the story, Allie? The mother's job was to take the pet home after show and tell. I'm sorry we're late, Mrs. Suncheck, said Mrs. Yaxley, who looked as if she had not taken time to put herself together and brush her hair. Danny insisted on bringing a squirrel to show and tell. I'm getting a prediction happening. What do you think squirrels like to do, or dogs like to do when they see a squirrel? I know mine like to chase them. Danny insisted on bringing his squirrel for show and tell. The cage was too big to carry. I had to stop and bore holes in a box, and, well, I'm not very good at making holes in boxes. All the boys thought it was funny. They were sure they would be good at boring holes, making holes. Class was excited. They were going to see a real live squirrel there in school. My squirrel is gnawing on the box. Danny's eyes were bright with excitement. A live squirrel? Exclaimed Mrs. Suncheck, smiling bravely. But how can we see in the wooden box? Danny said the aquarium was empty and we could put Frisky in the cardboard box over the top. Mrs. Yaxel looked apologetic. The whole thing was not her idea. Yes, said Danny, enthusiastic. Frisky will look really nice in the aquarium. The class will be delighted. A squirrel in an aquarium. All right, said Danny. Danny, said Mrs. Suncheck, I give you my permission. Go ahead. I'm sorry to take up so much class time, apologized Danny's mother as she put the wooden box inside the aquarium. Now, Danny, hold the cardboard over the top and clap it down. Quickly, when I take my hands out, she slid the back of the lid of the box. Ribsy, who had one eye open when he heard the murmurs of excitement from the children, caught a whiff of squirrel. He did not even stop to think. He automatically jumped to his feet, barking. Oh, startled Mrs. Yaxley gave the little scream and jumped away from the aquarium. She had not noticed Ribsy. Danny dropped the cardboard and the gray squirrel with the bushy tail darted out of the box and sprang up onto the edge of the aquarium. Ribsy put his paws up on the counter and barked furiously. The squirrel did not belong in here, chattered the frisky squirrel, and ran along the counter below the window with Ribsy following on the floor. The class laughed and shouted, "Catch him!" cried Mrs. Yaxel. The boy grabbed Ribsy by the collar. Ribsy pawed the air with his front feet, straining at his collar until it choked. Mrs. Suncheck pounded on her desk. Class, please! Here's a picture. You can see Ribsy getting choked, and there on the top, you can see the squirrel. Couple more pages, then we'll go outside. How could a class be quiet with a squirrel loose in the room? Nothing that interesting had happened since Billy Amato had brought a live clam to school. Frisky jumped to the top of the pile of supplemental readers in front of the room, and from there he took a flying leap to the staff of the supported by the flag. He took a flying leap to the staff that supported the flag in a bracket above the blackboard. Oh, he's on our flag. He's on the stick that holds the flag. Ribsy broke loose and ran under the flag. He put his paws on the chalk tray and made such a noise as he could. He would show that squirrel who belonged in this room. Frisky ran lightly up to the end of the staff that held the flag and scolded Ribsy. This infuriated Ribsy and delighted the class. If this keeps up, there would be no time for arithmetic, for math. People, please, cried Mrs. Suncheck, banging her on her desk with a ruler. Then the door opened and Mr. Woody, the principal, entered, followed by Mrs. Hildebrandt, the school nurse. At the sight of the principal, the class became a little quieter. Not much, but a little bit. I'm terribly sorry, said Mrs. Yaxley, wringing her hands. I didn't mean to take up so much of class time. Mr. Woody frowned at the class. Quiet, he ordered. What's going on in here? This time the class obeyed, but Ribsy did not. Neither did Frisky, the squirrel, who flirted his tail and scolded. Mr. Woodsy grasped the situation. Someone hold the dog, said the principal. Three boys ran to the front of the room. One tackled Ribsy, the other two grabbed his collar. Mrs. Suncheck, give me a jacket, directed the principal. Here, take mine. Danny pulled off his jacket and handed it to Mr. Woody. Ribsy, straining at his collar, panted hoarsely. These boys were spoiling his fun. Quiet, everybody. Quiet, everyone, repeated the principal. He walked to the front of the room and stepped up on one of the chairs in the reading circle. Now, Mrs. Suncheck, when I lift the flag down, you throw the jacket on the squirrel. Ribsy made a strangling noise while the class, quiet at last, waited breathlessly to see if the principal would work. This was much better than a live clam. Slowly, the principal reached the flagstaff, and slowly he lifted it from its bracket above the blackboard. The squirrel stopped chattering. Slowly, the principal lowered the staff. Never had Ribsy wanted to leap at anything so much in his life than he wanted to leap at this squirrel. Slowly, Mrs. Suncheck lifted Danny's jacket, said the squirrel. Said Frisky. Ribsy, who would accept anything from people, even a bubble bath, even a little straw hat and spectacles, resented the sassiness of the squirrel. He growled. Frisky leaped from the flagstaff, and Mrs. Suncheck tried to throw the jacket over him, but it fell empty on the floor while Frisky ran lightly along the chalk tray and hopped. This is a long chapter. And hopped to the floor and ran under the teacher's desk. Mrs. Suncheck picked up the jacket and prepared to try it again, while Mrs. Yaxley and Mrs. Hildebrandt took jackets from the cloakroom and prepared to stalk the angry squirrel. Mr. Woody replaced the flagstaff in its bracket and armed himself for a chase with the yardstick. Mrs. Suncheck kept on the chalk tray to use as a pointer. When some of the boys started for the cloakroom to get their jackets too, Mr. Woody said sternly, "In your seats, class." There was enough people running around the room already. Mr. Woody rattled the ruler under Mrs. Suncheck's desk. Frisky darted out and ran down the aisle. The three women threw jackets, missed, while Ribsy barked and strained at his collar. The girls pulled their feet up and screamed. The boys sat on their desks to get a better view. Mr. Woody said one of the boys who was holding Ribsy, "Why don't you let our mascot chase him? I bet he could catch him." "No," said half of the class, mostly girls, who felt sorry for the squirrel. "Yes," said the other half, mostly boys, who wanted to see a dog catch a squirrel. "Don't you dare stick a dog on my squirrel," said Danny, the boy who was holding Ribsy's collar. "Class," said Mrs. Suncheck. The squirrel skittered into the cloakroom. Naturally, the whole class had to turn around and face the back of the room. Ribsy could hardly stand it. If they would just let him go, he could show that squirrel a thing or two. "Now we've got him," said Mr. Woody. "Line up with jackets on the other end and go with the yardstick, and I'll chase him out." The three women stood at one door of the cloakroom. Oh, the teacher, the mom, and the nurse are the three women. Thumping, whacking could be heard from the cloakroom. "Look out! Here he comes!" yelled the principal. The teacher and mother, the school nurse, crouched with their jacket. There was a flash of gray fur, and all three pounced. "I've got him!" cried Mrs. Hildebrandt, the school nurse, who was on her knees clutching the wiggly jacket. "Quick, roll him up," said Mr. Yaxley, the principal. She took the rolled up squirrel and stuffed it, jacket and all, in the wooden box. "Hey, that's my jacket," said Billy Amato. "I'll bring it back before lunch," promised Mrs. Yaxley. "My mother isn't going to like it if a squirrel chews up my jacket," said Billy. Mrs. Yaxley looked as if she had had a difficult morning. "If he does, I'll buy you a new one," she said in desperation. Turning to the principal, she added apologetically, "I'm sorry, terribly sorry, I have taken up so much class time." "But won't the squirrel be smothered?" asked Penny mournfully. "He's not rolled up that tight," Danny's mother, who was in a hurry to get the squirrel home to his cage. "I never did to get to tell about my squirrel," said Danny. Never mind, Danny. You showed him, and that's enough. His mother spoke sharply before she escaped the classroom, with Frisky safely inside the box. It was all over. The class had slid back into their seats and waited to see what Mr. Woody would say about the interesting time they had when they were supposed to be learning arithmetic. Math. The principal came to the front of the room and gave Ribsy a stern look. Then he faced the expectant class. Boys and girls, Mr. Woody sounded very serious. Dogs are not allowed on the school grounds. The class looked guilty. They all knew this, but it was Mr. Woody himself who had called the dog their mascot. I'm afraid I made a mistake by making an exception. Mr. Woody looked once more at Ribsy. Now Ribsy looked guilty. He understood he had done something wrong, but he was not sure what it was. He thought dogs were supposed to chase squirrels to get rid of them. But this dog looked so friendly, continued Mr. Woody. He seemed so well behaved, I overlooked my rule. Ribsy wagged his tail wistfully to show that he did not mean to do anything wrong, that he really was a nice dog. Now we know, said Mr. Woody, that a dog does not make a good mascot, and that the rule is right. This should be a lesson for all of us. I'm afraid the dog will have to go. Oh, the class made a sad sound. Oh, they loved their mascot and did not want him to go. Neither did they want this morning, which had been so much fun, to turn into a lesson about obeying rules. When Mr. Woody looked at Ribsy, the dog stopped wagging his tail and let it droop. He knew he had not succeeded in making everything all right. He hung his head and looked dejected. Come on, boy, said Mr. Woody kindly, and took hold of Ribsy's collar. Come along with me. One of the girls in the front of the row began to cry. The whole class waved goodbye to Ribsy, and those in the last seats patted Ribsy as Mr. Woody led him out of the room. Mr. Woody did not let go of Ribsy's collar outside the classroom or even outside the building. He kept a tight grip until he led Ribsy outside the metal fence that surrounded the schoolyard. Only then did he let go of Ribsy and slammed the gate with a clang and said, "Goodbye, fellow." Ribsy understood one thing. He was no longer wanted, and this made him unhappy. And when Ribsy was unhappy, he seemed to droop all over. He took a few steps from the gate, stopped, looked back hopefully. Maybe the man would change his mind and call him so he could come back. The man had not changed. Go home, he said firmly. Go home. That was a command that Ribsy understood. He had heard it so many times on Click-Clack Street that he had run through the neighborhood flower beds. He had heard it when Henry did not want him to chase after cars. Now the words reminded him of Henry Huggins and the familiar street with green lawns and trees. Go home, repeated the principal. After one more backward glance, Ribsy started walking. He wanted to obey the man. He wanted to go home, but he did not know where home was, and there was no way he could make the man understand. Well, that's the end of chapter 4. Hope you come back for chapter 5. There's only 7 chapters. They're long. There's 7 chapters in this book. I'll see you next time. Bye.